The key didn't fit the lock. Delaney Shaw stood in front of 1408 Mercer Street, with the deed still fresh in her hand, and she understood that she had just made a terrible mistake. $4,200. That was everything she had paid, and it was everything her late husband had left her in this world. She had signed her name without asking a single question, because the broker had smiled too wide and talked too fast, and because she had spent 3 weeks sleeping in her car in a grocery store lot, too tired and too hungry to believe that something might finally go right for her. Now she understood why no one else had bid. Plywood over the windows, black paint across the glass, and an entire block so quiet it seemed everyone had learned not to look at that building. Delaney pressed her lips together. She had already cried her share. She had decided that 3 weeks earlier, the day they pushed her box of tools out onto the sidewalk during the busiest hour at the bakery, and her mother-in-law told her that her name was not on any of the paperwork. She was 27 years old, no parents, no family, no home, and she now legally owned a ruin. She pushed the side door. It wasn't locked. Inside there was dust and darkness, and against the back wall, a brick oven built into the building itself, the size of a car, still whole after 14 years. She laid her palm flat against the cold brick and found no crack in it anywhere. It could be saved. Then she stepped back outside, and 3 black cars sat nose to tail across the whole width of the street. Not one window in the neighborhood opened. That was the detail that told Delaney exactly who the man stepping out of the middle car was. And she had no idea yet that what lay beneath that black paint had been waiting 14 years for one particular person. If you believe that some doors that look broken turn out to be the right ones, leave a like on this story. Share it with someone who is starting over right now, because today might be the day they need to hear it. And subscribe to the channel so you can open a few more doors with us in the stories still to come. The man stopped 3 steps away from her and said nothing for longer than was normal. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a black wool coat, his dark hair cut neat, and there wasn't a single thing on him meant to draw attention except for the old gold-faced watch on his left wrist, the kind of watch a person didn't buy for himself but inherited from someone else. 2 other men stood slightly behind him, feet set apart, arms hanging loose at their sides, and the way they stood told Delaney they didn't need to do anything at all unless he told them to. She was still holding the deed in her hand, and she didn't put it away. "You're standing on Castellano family property," he said it very quietly. That was what made it frightening. Delaney had prepared herself for shouting, for a curse, for the kind of man who raised his voice so the whole street could hear. Instead, his voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it already owned everything within earshot. She held the paper out in front of her. "I bought this place this morning." She was surprised her voice didn't shake. "From a broker named Curtis Pell. I have the deed." Something shifted behind his eyes. It wasn't irritation. It was something else, gone so quickly she couldn't name it. One of the 2 men behind him moved half a step forward, and Delaney felt that half step inside her chest. The man in black raised 2 fingers, only a few inches, without turning his head. The other man stopped where he was as if he'd been nailed to the sidewalk. He didn't need to say a single word. "Nobody in this city has the right to sell that place," he said. "Not today. Not for the last 14 years. Nobody." The deed in her hand suddenly felt strangely heavy. Delaney looked down at it, at her own name typed across the page, at the round seal in the lower corner that she'd believed in that morning. "Then I've been cheated," she said. She didn't add anything else. She didn't explain, didn't plead her case, didn't drag it out. The last 3 weeks had taught her that people only listen to the first sentence, and everything after that just made them tired. He looked at her, not with a passing glance, but the way a person looked at a document when something in it didn't add up. His eyes moved from her mud-caked shoes to both of her hands, crossed with the scars of old burns, then stopped on her face longer than she wanted. Delaney didn't lower her eyes. She didn't stare back in challenge either. She simply stood there and let him look, because she'd run out of things she could lose. Wind moved down Mercer Street, and somewhere near the end of the block a screen door slapped against its frame. Not a single window opened. "What's your name?" he asked. "Delaney Shaw." "Where do you live, Miss Shaw?" The question was so simple it felt cruel. She thought of the car in the supermarket parking lot on Halsted Street, of the folded blanket in the trunk, of how she'd handed all $4,200 to a stranger that morning, exactly 1 hour before standing here. "I don't live anywhere," she said. He gave one very small nod, as if she'd just given him exactly the answer he'd already expected. Then he turned halfway and looked at the building behind her, at the plywood over the windows and the black paint across the glass, and in that moment his expression changed. Delaney saw it clearly. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment at being trespassed against. It was something much heavier and much older, the kind of thing a person only carried on his face when he looked at a place he'd deliberately refused to look at for years. He turned back. "You've been inside. It wasn't a question. The side door wasn't locked," she said. "I know," he said, and she didn't understand why those two words sent cold across the back of her neck. The man in black stepped back and opened the rear door of the middle car. "Get in." Delaney didn't move right away. She was 27 years old, and she wasn't stupid. She knew exactly where she was standing, knew how the entire block had gone quiet in an organized way from the moment those 3 cars pulled up, knew that a woman with no one to call was also a woman no one would come looking for. She looked at the open car door, then at him. "What are you going to do to me?" she asked. There was a very brief silence. Then he said, still in that same low, even voice, "Feed you. Then you'll tell me how you ended up here." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't quite an order either. It was something that lived exactly in between, and Delaney realized this man had probably spent his entire life in that space. She thought about the last 3 weeks, about the folded blanket in the trunk of her car, about how she'd run out of better choices long before this afternoon. She folded the deed carefully along its old creases and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. Then she stepped forward and got into the car. The door closed very softly behind her, and it would be many months before Delaney understood that this wasn't the first time the name Shaw had been spoken inside that car. The car drove for less than 10 minutes before stopping in an alley behind an Italian restaurant with a neon sign that had one letter burned out. Delaney had prepared herself for a warehouse, for an iron door, for something cold and empty. What she walked into instead was a small dining room behind the kitchen, warm enough that the windows were fogged with condensation, the tables covered in white cloths, and 4 men sitting quietly over dinner at a long table. Not one of the 4 looked up when she passed, not because they hadn't seen her, because they'd learned how not to see. Rafael Castellano took off his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and sat at the head of a small table in the corner. He gestured to the chair across from him. Delaney sat down, her back straight, both hands resting in her lap. It was a posture she'd learned very young, the posture of someone trying to take up as little space as possible without appearing afraid. She was trying to unlearn it. "Tell me about the man who sold you that place," he said. "His name is Curtis Pell." "I know his name. I want to know what he looks like." Delaney closed her eyes for half a second. About 45, big but not fat. Thinning hair combed straight back. He wore a wedding ring, but it was loose. It kept turning around his finger while he talked. His voice. Fast. He talked faster than he needed to, and he laughed before he finished a sentence, not after. Raphael nodded very slowly. What was he carrying? A brown leather briefcase. Old. The handle was worn where he held it. She stopped. Something had just surfaced in her memory, a detail so small she'd forgotten it all day. "The clasp was broken," she said. When he took the papers out, it sprang open and some things inside fell onto the floor. I bent down to help pick them up. Raphael said nothing. He only looked at her, and Delaney understood that he was waiting for her to continue. "There was a business card," she said. I picked it up and handed it back to him. He snatched it a little too quickly, faster than he needed to for a business card. She gave a small shrug. I didn't think anything of it then. I was too busy thinking about how much money I had left in my wallet. The man sitting at the head of the long table glanced over once, then lowered his eyes to his plate again. Raphael's expression hadn't changed, but something in the weight of his gaze had. "Do you remember what was written on the card?" Delaney tried to remember. She could see the wooden floor of that temporary rented office again, see her own hand holding out the piece of stiff paper, see Pell's fingers snatching it away, but not the words on it. "No," she said. "I'm sorry. I didn't read it." "That's all right," he said, and his voice remained so calm that she couldn't tell whether it mattered or not. No one in that room, Delaney included, understood what the detail she'd just mentioned meant, and no one thought to ask her how many cards she'd picked up. The kitchen door opened, and a woman came in, her salt and pepper hair cut short, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, the fingers of her right hand stained with ink so deeply it wouldn't wash away. She was about 54, and she looked Delaney up and down for exactly 2 seconds, before turning to Raphael as though Delaney weren't there. "You called me at 5:15, she said. "It's 7 o'clock now." "Bernadette," Raphael said. "Feed her, then find her somewhere to sleep." Bernadette Moss looked at her again, longer this time. "All right," she said, and didn't ask a single question. Raphael stood and picked up his coat. He paused for a moment beside Delaney's chair. "We'll talk again tomorrow morning," he said. Then he went out through the back door, and as he passed, the 4 men at the long table set down their forks one after another, without anyone telling them to. Bernadette disappeared into the kitchen and came back with a bowl of soup, setting it down in front of Delaney with half a loaf of bread and a spoon. "Eat," she said, then pulled out the chair across from her, folded her arms, and didn't eat anything herself. She only watched. Delaney picked up the spoon. The soup was hot enough that she had to blow on it, thick, with white beans and carrots, and something that left a faint heat at the back of her tongue. She ate slowly, without rushing, because she'd learned that eating too quickly in front of strangers told them too much about you. But by the 3rd spoonful, her throat began to ache. Not from the heat, not from hunger either, though she'd been hungry for 3 weeks in the way people were hungry, when every day they only dared buy the cheapest thing on the shelf. Her throat hurt, because this was the first time since Wesley's funeral that someone had put something in front of her without attaching a question, a condition, a paper she had to sign, or a look reminding her that she owed them something. She lowered her head over the bowl and kept eating, and she didn't cry, because she'd already cried all she had to give. Bernadette sat silently and watched her finish every last bite. Then she said, her voice dry as if she were reading a line from a ledger, "You're the woman who lost the Hart family bakery." Delaney set the spoon down very slowly. The woman hadn't asked. She'd known before she'd even walked into the room. "You know who I am," Delaney said. "I knew your name at 5:20, Bernadette replied. "I knew who you were by 5:45. He pays me to do that quickly." She nudged the plate of bread a little closer to Delaney, a gesture so small it almost didn't exist. "But some things aren't in the paperwork, so I ask." Delaney picked up a piece of bread, then set it down again. She had told this story 3 times in 3 weeks. Once to someone at the legal aid office, once to a woman at a church on Ashland Street, and once to herself in the car at 2 o'clock in the morning. By the 3rd time, her voice had gone flat. She had trained it to stay flat, because every time it rose or caught on something, she lost another evening to it. "My husband was Wesley Hart," she said. "He died last April. Stroke. He was 30. Bernadette said nothing. She only sat there and left the silence where it was, the kind of silence that belonged to someone who understood that interrupting now would mean losing the rest. "We had a small bakery on Kedzie Street," Delaney continued. "He bought it 2 years before we got married. He didn't have enough money, so his mother loaned it to him." Loretta held the promissory note. She looked down at the white tablecloth. "I worked there for 4 years. I needed dough starting at 3 o'clock in the morning. I did the ordering, paid the 2 employees, fixed the refrigerator when it broke. But my name wasn't on a single piece of paper." "You never asked him?" "I did. Many times," Delaney said. "He said next week. It was always next week. We were busy, and he said paperwork could always be done later, but dough wouldn't wait." She paused. Then there wasn't a next week anymore. Bernadette lifted a hand and rubbed at the ink stain on her index finger, out of habit rather than any real attempt to remove it. 6 weeks after the funeral, she said. It wasn't a question. 6 weeks, Delaney confirmed. She and my husband's brother sold the bakery. I found out from a sign taped to the front window when I came to open the place at 4 o'clock in the morning. Bernadette sat very still for a long time. Then she asked, her voice as dry as before, "And where did the $4,200 come from?" "Wesley's life insurance," Delaney said. "He had a small policy from back when he worked for someone else and had forgotten to cancel it. It was the only thing with my name on it." She picked up the piece of bread again, and this time she held it tightly in her hand. "I kept it for 9 months. I didn't spend a cent. Then this morning I handed all of it to a stranger in an office he rented by the hour." Bernadette gave her a long look that Delaney couldn't read. It wasn't pity. Delaney had shut the door on pity a long time ago. It was more like the look of someone fitting one piece into a puzzle and not liking the picture it created. "Do you know what the place you were trying to buy is?" Bernadette asked. 1408 Mercer Street. That's the address. I'm asking whether you know what that place is." Delaney looked up. No. Bernadette opened her mouth. She had already begun to speak. The first sound had left her throat, and then she stopped. She closed her mouth, pushed her chair back, stood, and picked up the empty bowl. Ask him tomorrow morning, she said. That isn't my story to tell. She led Delaney up a narrow staircase behind the kitchen to a small room on the second floor, with a single bed, a table lamp, and a stack of clean towels already waiting at the foot of the bed. No one asked whether she needed anything. No one told her what she had to do. Bernadette only paused in the doorway and said, "This door locks from the inside." Then she went downstairs, and the sound of her footsteps faded into the stairwell. Delaney sat on the edge of the bed in the same clothes, still carrying dust from the house on Mercer Street, and didn't turn on the light. Below her, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen grew farther apart, then stopped altogether. Somewhere out on the street, a car engine roared and disappeared. She thought about the question Bernadette had left unfinished, and about the way the woman had stopped herself halfway through, like someone who had just realized she was standing at the edge of a story that didn't belong to her. But Bernadette wasn't what kept Delaney awake, staring at the ceiling. It was Rafael Castellano's face when she'd said the address aloud on the street. She replayed that moment in her mind 4 times, and every time she arrived at the same conclusion. It hadn't been surprise. Surprise was quick and shallow. What she'd seen on his face had moved much more slowly, and it had already been there before, waiting for that address to bring it to the surface. It was something far older than surprise. And in the darkness of that small room, Delaney realized something that made her turn onto her side and face the wall. He hadn't asked what she wanted to do with the place. Not once all evening. Bernadette Moss came down to the dining room behind the kitchen at 6:20 in the morning, carrying a file as thick as a finger and the smell of coffee from the machine in the corner. Raphael was already sitting there, the cuffs of his shirt still unbuttoned, his father's watch lying face down on the table beside a cup of cold coffee. He hadn't slept. Bernadette knew because she'd worked for this family for 16 years, and she knew the look of a man who had spent an entire night sitting with something he didn't want to think about. She set the file down in front of him. "You're not going to like this," she said. Raphael opened the first page. "The bakery on Kedzie Street," Bernadette said. "Her husband's place. Her mother-in-law and brother-in-law sold it 3 weeks ago. She waited until he reached the line she wanted him to see. Look at the buyer." Raphael's finger stopped halfway down the page. The name on the contract belonged to a limited liability company registered in Delaware, formed 11 months earlier, with no history and no other assets except 3 real estate purchases on the south side of Chicago. "I ran that name through Curtis Pell's records," Bernadette said. "It shows up 3 more times. 3 other properties, all of them within a 4-block radius of Mercer. All bought within the last 9 months. Raphael said nothing. He turned to the next page, then the one after that, and Bernadette watched his jaw tighten a little more with every sheet of paper. "There's more," she said. "I talked to her at 11 o'clock last night, after she woke up to get some water." She pulled out a chair and sat down. Pell showed her 3 places. Raphael looked up. 3 places, Bernadette repeated. 1 in Bridgeport, 1 behind the freight station, and Mercer. At the first 2, he only stopped the car outside, pointed, and told her the price. He didn't open the doors. He said the keys were back at the office. She rested her elbows on the table. Mercer was the only one he unlocked and let her walk into. Raphael set the file down. He took her inside. He took her straight to the back wall, Bernadette said. "She told me exactly how it happened. He didn't say anything about the roof, didn't say anything about the plumbing, didn't say anything about what it would cost to repair the place. He just stood beside the brick oven and stayed quiet while she looked at it. The room was very still. On the other side of the kitchen door, someone dropped a pot into the sink, and the sound seemed louder than it should have. He knew she was a baker, Raphael said. He knew before he ever met her, Bernadette said. Think about it. A woman who just lost her husband, just lost her bakery. No parents, no siblings, no one to stand up and ask questions for her. She had exactly $4,200 in her account, and that money sat untouched for 9 months. Who knew that? Raphael didn't answer because the answer was too obvious. "The people who bought her bakery," Bernadette said for him. The same name, on the same piece of paper. Raphael picked up the watch, turned it over, but didn't put it on. He looked at it for a long time. "The oven wasn't luck," he said. "No," Bernadette said. "It was bait." You don't put a baker in an empty building. You put her in a building with the oven still intact. $4,200 was the cheapest thing they bought in this entire scheme. Raphael set the watch back on the table, very gently. You don't cheat a homeless woman out of $4,000 and then file the paperwork properly, he said. $4,000 isn't worth showing your face for. They didn't need her money. No, Bernadette said. They needed her signature. Raphael sat in silence for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was so low Bernadette had to lean forward. She didn't wander into this, he said. Someone sent her here. Bernadette gave one small nod. What are you going to do? Raphael looked toward the small window above the sink, where the sky was changing from black to gray. I want to know who's behind the Delaware Company. I'm already working on it. It'll take a few days, maybe longer. They hid it well. She paused. What about her? Raphael didn't answer right away. Does she know? Bernadette asked. No. Are you going to tell her? There was a long silence. Not yet, he said. Upstairs, Delaney Shaw woke at 6:45, folded the blanket into a neat square, and stacked the clean towels back exactly where they'd been at the foot of the bed, the habit of someone who had spent years trying not to become a burden to anyone. She stood at the window looking down into the alley and thought that maybe she was the unluckiest woman in all of Chicago, that out of thousands of abandoned buildings on the south side she'd somehow stumbled into the one building no one was allowed to sell, and that her bad luck had a special talent for always finding the most exact place to land. She believed that all morning. She had no idea that none of it was accidental, and that someone had chosen her months ago, carefully, patiently, in exactly the way a person chooses a key for a lock they've been watching for a very long time. He was waiting for her at the mouth of the alley at 7:30, without the other two men, without the 3 cars, just a black sedan parked close to the curb, and him standing beside it with both hands in the pockets of his coat. Come with me, he said. The drive was silent for the entire 10 minutes. When they stopped, it wasn't in front of Mercer Street, but in the alley behind it. A narrow passage paved with broken brick, running between 2 red brick walls darkened by years of rain and weather. From this angle, the building was larger than she'd thought. Not a storefront, but 2 stories with a ruined courtyard and a rear door made of oak twice as thick as the side door she'd pushed open the day before. Raphael stood looking at that door for a long time without going near it. My mother baked here, he said. Delaney turned to look at him. For 20 years, he continued. Before she married my father, and for many years afterward, she opened at 4 o'clock in the morning. The whole neighborhood bought bread from her. People didn't call this place 1408. They called it Rosa's Place. He said her name carefully, the way someone set something fragile down on a table. Her name was Rosa Castellano. Delaney stood very still. She thought of the brick oven without a single crack, of the dust lying across the counter, of the way an entire block had learned the habit of not looking at that place. That's why no one was allowed to sell it, she said. That's part of the reason, Raphael replied. He walked over to the back steps and sat down, and the gesture was so strange that it took Delaney a moment to understand what she was seeing. This man didn't sit on steps. She'd seen the way 4 men had set down their forks when he walked past them. Yesterday you asked me what I was going to do with you, he said. Now I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear all of it before you decide anything about me. Delaney didn't sit down. She stood a few steps away from him with her hands tucked into the pockets of her apron, and she waited. When I was 19, my father started taking me with him, Raphael said, to meetings, to see people, to places a 19-year-old had no business being. I learned fast. I learned that a family lived according to the way people looked at it. He looked down at his hands. One night, at another family's house, an old man made a joke about my mother. There wasn't anything cruel in it. He only said that the Castellano family had a queen standing behind a counter, selling bread for 35 cents a loaf. Everyone at the table laughed. My father laughed too. He paused. I didn't. I was 19, and I sat there with my face burning for the rest of the meal. Delaney said nothing. That night I went home and talked to my mother. His voice didn't change. Still low. Still even. And that was what made the story heavier. I told her she should stop. I told her our family didn't need 35 cents a loaf. I told her people were laughing at us because of it, and that she was embarrassing my father. He lifted his eyes toward the oak door. She didn't argue with me once. She just looked at me for a long time, Exactly the way you looked at me on the street yesterday. Then she said, "All right, Raphael." The alley was very quiet. Somewhere above them came the sound of pigeons beating their wings as they left the edge of a roof. "She closed the following Friday," he said. "She never told anyone why. She let me keep the reason to myself. That was the last kindness she ever did for me. And at the time I didn't even understand that it was kindness." Delaney waited, and she'd already guessed what came next before he said it, but it still struck her in the chest like something heavy. 14 months later, she died, Raphael said. There was no illness beforehand. One morning she just didn't wake up. He stood from the step and brushed off his hands, and the ordinary nature of the gesture was almost cruel. "My father put this place into a trust the very next month. No one could sell it. No one could lease it. No one could touch it. He died 6 years later, and the trust stayed exactly as it was." He turned to Delaney, and for the first time since they'd met, he looked at her without measuring anything at all. "People think I keep this place to remember her," he said. "I don't." Delaney asked very quietly. "Then why?" Raphael was silent so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. "So I don't have to say it out loud," he said. "As long as that door stays closed, I can pretend it was an accident. Pretend she got older. Pretend she got tired. Pretend it was something natural." He looked at the black paint across the downstairs window frame. "If I open it, then I have to admit that I was the one who told her to stop, and that she stopped only because I was ashamed of her." Wind moved through the narrow alley, and Delaney stood there with both scarred hands in the pockets of her apron, understanding at last that for 14 years the building hadn't been abandoned at all. It had been guarded by a man who couldn't bring himself to walk through his own door. Delaney looked at the oak door, then at the black paint, then down at her 2 hands. She heard her own voice before she'd even decided what she was going to say. "I want to restore it." Raphael turned back. "What?" "The building," she said, and the moment she said it, she knew it was true. The kind of truth that came from somewhere beneath thought, from that place where a person knew something before they could explain why. "I want to scrape all the paint off the glass, take down the plywood, repair the oven, make it into something again." He didn't answer. She understood what that silence meant. He was waiting for the rest, the part people always added when they were asking for something. So she gave him the rest in her own way. "I know it isn't mine," she said. "The paper in my pocket is worthless. I understand that now. I'm not asking for anything." She pulled both hands out of her apron pockets, not to gesture, but because she wanted him to see them. Old burn scars crossed her knuckles, marks left by 10 years of oven doors and hot trays. "I know how to work. I've been getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning for 10 years. I know mortar, I know fire brick, I know what a blocked chimney sounds like. I'm not asking for charity." She stopped. That was everything she'd meant to say, and she didn't add anything more. The last 3 weeks had taught her that the more a person talked, the more they diminished themselves. Raphael stood still for a long time. Wind moved through the narrow alley, lifting a scrap of wrapping paper before letting it fall again. He looked at her, not at her hands, but directly into her face, and Delaney saw something shift behind his eyes, slowly, like a heavy door turning on rusted hinges. "You can stay," he said. Delaney didn't react at once. She'd prepared herself for a polite refusal, for a small check, for a car to take her to the station. She hadn't prepared herself for those 3 words. "Someone will bring tools today," he continued, his voice calm again, the voice of a man who had made a decision and had no intention of reconsidering it. "Hammers, chisels, ladders, lights, whatever else you need, tell Bernadette. You'll sleep in the room above the restaurant until that place is fit to live in." He looked toward the mouth of the alley. "No one will bother you here. You understand what I mean." Delaney did. She understood perfectly. "Why?" she asked. The question escaped before she could stop it, and it sounded smaller than she wanted. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. I was standing on your property with a forged deed, and you could have called the police, or more simply, you could have just told me to leave." Raphael buttoned the collar of his coat again. He did it very slowly, and Delaney realized he was using the motion to buy himself time. "Because my mother would have done the same thing," he said. Then he turned away. He didn't wait for her to thank him, didn't wait for her to say anything else, and Delaney stood there with her lips slightly parted and a sentence that hadn't had time to form. He had gone about 15 steps down the alley when he stopped. He didn't turn around. He didn't say anything. He simply stood still between the two red brick walls for exactly 1 moment. His shoulders lowered slightly, his head tilted almost imperceptibly toward the building behind him, like a man listening for a sound he hadn't heard in a very long time. Just 1 moment. Then he kept walking, and his footsteps became even again. At the far end of the alley, Bernadette Moss stood beside a lamppost with a stack of papers tucked under one arm and a paper cup of cold coffee in her hand. No one knew how long she'd been standing there, and no one knew how much she'd heard. She watched Raphael walk past her without seeing her at all, something that had never happened once in 16 years. She watched him go all the way to the car. Then she turned and looked back at the woman standing alone in the middle of the alley, both scarred hands hanging at her sides, and something appeared on Bernadette's face that she herself wouldn't have admitted to if anyone had asked. She had served that man for 16 years. She knew how many hours he slept, how many cups of coffee he drank, how he placed his hand on a table when he was about to say no. She knew every line in the rhythm of his stride, every small habit he himself never noticed. And in all those 16 years, she'd never once seen him stop like that. The tools arrived before noon that day, piled in the back alley without anyone knocking on the door, without anyone waiting for her thanks. Delaney started with the front windows because she wanted the light to come in first. The black paint covering the glass had been there for 14 years, and it refused to peel away in sheets, only in narrow strips beneath the scraper blade. So she worked one pane at a time, from top to bottom, and by the end of the first day, she had cleared 2.5 panes and could no longer feel the tip of her thumb. On the second day, she took down the plywood. On the third day, she dug the ash out of the oven, ash that had hardened into gray cakes and gave off a dry, ancient smell that barely smelled like smoke anymore. Blisters rose across both palms, broke open, then formed somewhere else, and she wrapped them in clean cloth and kept working. By the third day, 3 men from the neighborhood came on their own. The oldest of them stopped in the doorway, looked inside for a long time, then said he knew how to brace the sagging section of the beam on the left, and that he wouldn't take any money for the work. Delaney said she didn't accept free labor. He asked what she intended to pay him with. She pointed at the oven. From the next morning on, all 3 men arrived at 7 o'clock, and each one went home carrying a warm loaf of bread wrapped in paper, and none of the 4 of them ever said another word about money. On the afternoon of the third day, Delaney moved into the storage room at the back. It was a small space, barely large enough for 2 wooden shelves, and at some point in the past, someone had painted the walls there again and again, layer over layer, until the surface had thickened and hardened into something like a shell. She scraped at it out of habit, not for any particular reason. On the second layer, the scraper caught. She stopped. There was a shallow indentation in the stone, not deep, but regular in the way only a human hand could make. She switched to a stiff brush and water, then to a piece of cloth, and for more than an hour beneath the yellow light of a temporary hanging bulb, she worked at it, lifting each layer of paint from the stone as carefully as removing a bandage from an old wound. 4 layers. 4 times someone had tried to cover it. What emerged at chest height was a sheaf of wheat, lying inside an unfinished circle, open at the top, and from the bottom of that circle, 2 straight lines ran downward, like roots sinking into the stone. Beneath it, carved in the square, careful strokes of someone unaccustomed to writing on stone, was a single word: Entra. She settled back on her heels and stared at it for a long time. She didn't hear the footsteps on the brick floor behind her. "Where did you find it?" Delaney didn't startle. She had grown used to him arriving without warning, standing in the doorway to watch for a while, then leaving again. But this time his voice was different. "The storage room wall," she said, "under 4 layers of paint. You couldn't see anything from the outside." Raphael stepped in. Then he did something Delaney had never seen him do. He lowered himself onto one knee on the dirty brick floor, paying no attention to his trousers or the ash dust scattered everywhere, and lifted one finger to the edge of the broken circle. He touched it very lightly, the way someone touched something they were afraid might disappear. "Do you know what this means?" he asked. "No. Back when there was almost nothing in this neighborhood," he said. "Before my father's time, people came here from across the ocean with no money, no language, no one they knew. Some families carved this mark beside their doors." His finger followed the 2 roots running downward. "It meant that if someone was hungry, they could knock. No one asked why. No one was turned away. You didn't have to explain who you were, where you came from, or how you ended up like this. You only had to knock. Delaney looked at the unfinished circle and felt something tighten inside her chest. Who carved it? She asked, though she already knew. Raphael didn't answer directly. She told me about it once, he said. I was little, maybe 7 or 8. I asked why she was cutting into the wall of her own building and ruining the stone. She told me people could forget a name. They could take down a sign. They could paint over anything. He paused. She said that if one day she disappeared from this world, that mark would still be there. Proof that she'd existed. Proof that she'd believed in something. The street outside was very quiet. Delaney placed her cloth-wrapped palm against the cold stone, just beneath the carving. I'll restore it, she said, exactly as it was. Every line. At the original depth. I won't change anything, and I won't make it prettier. Exactly the way she left it. Raphael turned his head and looked at her. Something crossed his face, there and gone too quickly for her to name. All right, he said. Just one word. But he stayed kneeling there for a long time after he'd finished saying it. The gray sedan appeared on Monday morning, parked about 6 buildings down from the shop on the other side of the street. Delaney noticed it because she was scraping the last window pane, and from where she stood she could see the entire block. There were 2 men inside. They didn't get out, didn't smoke, didn't listen to music. On Tuesday morning the car was there again, in the same place, facing the same direction. Wednesday morning was the same. She wasn't afraid. She had assumed they were Raphael's men, that this was exactly what he'd meant when he said no one would bother her here, and she felt something unfamiliar inside herself that she had no intention of naming. On Wednesday morning, when Bernadette arrived with 2 cups of coffee and a stack of supply invoices that needed signatures, Delaney pointed through the glass she'd just scraped clean. Tell those men I'm fine, she said. It's been 3 days. They must be bored out of their minds. Bernadette followed the direction of her finger. She looked for about 2 seconds. Then she set her coffee down on the counter, more slowly than usual. Those aren't our people. Delaney turned around. What? Our people don't park where they can be seen from the window, Bernadette said. And our people don't change license plates between the 2nd day and the 3rd. Delaney set down the scraper blade. A cold feeling moved the length of her spine, not because of the 2 men outside, but because of the way Bernadette said it, as calmly as if she were reading the weather. Then who are they? Bernadette pulled out a chair, sat down, and pushed the 2nd coffee toward her. Sit, she said. There's something you need to know, and I'm telling you because he won't. Delaney sat down. For the last 3 years, this family has been under investigation, Bernadette said. Not by city police. Federal. They went from the docks to transportation, then to a few warehouse leasing companies. 3 years. She turned the coffee cup slowly in her hands. Last September it ended. Not because they lost, because there was a deal. Delaney waited. He signed it, Bernadette said. He paid the fines, surrendered 3 parts of the business, and agreed to let them monitor the books for 5 years. In return, no one in the family went to prison, and the men you saw eating dinner in the back room the night you arrived are still sitting there eating. She looked up. Do you understand now? Since September, every single day, he's lived with their people parked outside. Delaney looked through the window. The gray sedan was still exactly where it had been. But they're investigating him, she said slowly. What does that have to do with me? You're standing inside property held by a Castellano family trust, with a deed carrying your name, Bernadette said. You think that doesn't make it into somebody's report? Delaney went quiet. Listen carefully. Bernadette set down her cup. That man could buy this entire block before lunch. He knows the wives of every alderman in this part of the city. He makes 1 phone call and 30 people show up within 40 minutes. She looked Delaney straight in the eyes. And he isn't allowed to do any of that anymore. Not one thing. All it takes is for him to lay 1 finger on the wrong person, or for someone to say he did, and that agreement tears apart like paper, and the whole family goes down at once. Delaney thought of the man who had lifted 2 fingers and frozen someone in place on the sidewalk. She thought of the 4 men setting down their forks as he passed. She thought of the way an entire block had learned not to look out its windows. The man who sold me that paper, she said quietly. Curtis Pell? If this had happened 4 years ago, Bernadette said, then by the afternoon you arrived, he would have handed back your $4,200, apologized to you twice, and disappeared from this city before dark. She gave a small shrug. Now he has to hire lawyers, file papers, wait, Stand in line like everybody else." Delaney sat very still. Outside, one of the two men in the gray sedan raised a hand to adjust the rearview mirror. "Then why is he still letting me stay here?" she asked. "I'm the most dangerous thing in his life right now. I'm a stranger's name sitting on his paperwork." Bernadette Moss looked at her for a long time, and for the first time in the 3 days Delaney had known her, something softened in that hard face. "Yes," she said. "You are." Then she stood, gathered both coffee cups, and walked toward the door without offering another word of explanation. Delaney remained alone in the dusty room as sunlight, for the first time in 14 years, poured through the glass she'd scraped clean, and she understood something that perhaps no one else in the city had noticed yet. The most powerful man on the south side of Chicago was more tightly bound than anyone, and she was the first person to see it. The oven damper was stuck because of rust, not because it was broken, and it took Delaney 2 days to understand that. She soaked the hinges in oil, tapped lightly along the iron edge 1 careful beat at a time, and by the afternoon of the second day the lever had moved about half an inch. By evening, it opened all the way. She reached into the chimney and pulled out 2 handfuls of dried beeswax along with something that had once been a bird's nest. Then she lit a small twist of paper and stood watching the smoke rise, straight upward, without spilling back down. She sank onto the brick floor in front of the oven and laughed by herself in the empty room, a dry, brief laugh, the first sound of that kind to come out of her since April of the previous year. She lit the fire at 1 o'clock the next morning. The 3 workmen had left firewood stacked neatly in the corner without saying anything about it. She tended the fire for 2.5 hours, then raked the coals to one side and held her palm inside to test the heat, counting silently in her head the way she'd been counting for 10 years. She had mixed the dough the night before with ingredients bought from the store at the end of the block. Nothing special, only flour, water, yeast, and salt. She shaped 12 loaves. She scored the tops with a knife she'd borrowed from Bernadette. Then she slid them into the oven that had been silent for 14 years and closed the damper. At 4:15 in the morning, the smell of baking bread drifted out of number 1,408 Mercer Street for the first time in 14 years. Delaney took 2 loaves from the tray, wrapped them in paper, and walked 6 buildings down the street through the darkness before dawn. The 2 men in the gray sedan saw her coming from a distance, and both of them sat up straighter. She knocked on the driver's window. The man lowered it about a hand's width and said nothing. "They're still warm," she said, holding the 2 paper-wrapped loaves through the opening. He looked at her, then at the 2 packages of bread, then at the man beside him, who didn't seem to know what to do either. Of all the things those 2 men had been trained to deal with, there was no section covering a woman bringing them bread at 4:20 in the morning. "We're not allowed to accept anything, ma'am," the driver said. "I'm not selling it," Delaney said. "I'm giving it to you. You've been sitting out here for 3 days, and it's cold." She set the 2 paper packages on the roof of the car. "Eat them or don't. I'm going to bed." Then she turned and walked back. She was halfway to the shop when she heard a car door open behind her, but she didn't turn around. Raphael arrived at 4:45. He stopped in the middle of the sidewalk in front of the shop and didn't step inside. Delaney saw him through the glass she'd scraped clean, and she understood at once that he hadn't simply been passing by, that someone had called him, or that he'd smelled the bread from the end of the street. She picked up a loaf that was still warm and carried it outside. He didn't say anything. She held it out to him. He took it in both hands, lowered his head, and broke the loaf in half, right there on the sidewalk. Steam rose between his palms into the cold air before dawn. Then he ate, standing right there on the street in his black wool coat with his father's watch on his wrist, and in that moment, Delaney saw nothing more and nothing less than a man of 34 eating bread on a sidewalk at 5 o'clock in the morning. There was nothing in the way he stood that would make anyone set down a fork when he walked past. He finished half the loaf. Then he stopped. He didn't look at her. He looked down at the piece of bread still in his hand, and Delaney saw his jaw move once. "This smell," he said. That was all. He didn't continue. He stood there for a very long time, long enough for the sky at the end of the street to begin turning gray, long enough for Delaney to understand that anything she said now would be too much, so she said nothing. She simply stood beside him in the cold and let him stand there. A few buildings away, a second-floor window lit up, then another one across the street. An elderly woman in the corner building cracked open her shutters, leaned her head outside, and stood there, breathing in the air for a long moment before withdrawing again. Down the street, The door of the gray sedan was still open, and one of the two men stood leaning against the car with a half-opened paper package in his hand. The whole of Mercer Street was waking to a smell it had forgotten long ago, and not one of them knew exactly why they had gotten out of bed so early. The second batch baked unevenly. Delaney knew the moment she pulled the tray out. The right side was exactly one shade darker than the left, the kind of difference only someone who had stood in front of an oven for 10 years would notice. She waited until the oven had cooled completely, then crawled inside with a flashlight clenched at the corner of her mouth and ran her hand along every fire brick on the right wall, searching for a gap where heat was escaping. She found it in the fourth row from the bottom. One brick didn't sit flush with the mortar around it, and along its upper edge was a narrow gap no thicker than a fingernail. She tapped it lightly 3 times with a chisel. The brick slid outward with almost no force, as though it had been placed there so that one day it could be removed easily. Behind it was a hollow space, and inside that hollow was a package wrapped in wax paper. Delaney crawled backward out of the oven and sat on the brick floor with the package in her lap. The paper had yellowed and gone stiff after 14 years of heat and cold taking turns against it, but it was still intact, folded carefully along 4 creases and pressed flat. Inside was a sheet of paper folded in half. The handwriting slanted gently, written in ink, the letters round and even, the hand of a woman who had learned to write somewhere very far from here. The ink had faded to brown. There was no date at the top of the page, no name of a recipient, and at the bottom, no signature. If you're holding this paper, it means the building is still standing, and it means something survived. I don't know who you are. I don't know how you came here, or how long from today it will be before you find this place. But I know you came here because you needed to come. I know because I was once the same. I came to this door with empty hands, with nothing, with no one, and the door still opened. Keep the mark on the storage room wall. It's older than I am and older than you are. It says you're safe here, and that is true, even if you can't believe it yet. Whatever pushed you to this door, let it be the last thing that breaks you. Don't let there be a second thing. From here on, you feed people. Start with yourself. Delaney read the letter all the way through once. Then she read it again from the beginning. The second time, when she reached the line about empty hands, something inside her chest broke open. Not slowly, but all at once, like a load-bearing wall that had been cracked for a long time and had only been waiting for someone to place one final ounce upon it. She sank onto the brick floor in the middle of the empty room with the paper held between her cloth-wrapped hands, and she cried. She cried the way someone cried after holding it back for too long, without sound, only her shoulders shaking and her breathing breaking apart, and she cried for everything she'd decided not to cry over during the last 11 months. For Wesley lying on the kitchen floor at 4 o'clock in the morning, for the sign taped to the bakery window, for 3 weeks in the car in the parking lot on Halstead Street, for the $4,200 she'd held onto for 9 months, as though she were holding the last remaining piece of a person, only to hand all of it to a stranger whose smile was too wide, for the thought she'd carried for 3 weeks that she was the unluckiest woman in this city, and that there wasn't a single person left in the world who remembered she existed. She didn't hear the footsteps outside the doorway. Raphael stopped at the threshold, and he saw everything. He didn't step inside. He didn't turn away either. He stood there with one hand resting against the wooden doorframe. And he stayed. He didn't say a word, didn't ask whether she was all right, didn't offer her anything she would have to accept, because he understood better than most that sometimes the only kindness a person could give was simply not to leave. He stood there for a long time, until her breathing became steady again. Delaney wiped her face slowly with the cuff of her sleeve, and she didn't apologize for crying. She only held the paper out toward him. Raphael stepped across the threshold. He came to her and took it in both hands, carefully, the way someone held something that might break if tilted the wrong way. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He didn't read it. He only looked down at the page, at the slanting lines of handwriting faded to brown, and his eyes followed the shape of the words rather than their meaning. He stood that way for about a minute. His jaw moved once. "Who did she write it for?" Delaney asked softly. "For whoever needed it most," he said. "My mother always thought that way. She didn't write for one person. She wrote for an empty place, and then she trusted that someone would come and fill it." He folded the paper again, along the same 4 old creases, without missing by even a millimeter, and handed it back to her. Delaney shook her head. "It's yours," she said. "She was your mother. She hid it in the oven." Raphael said. Not in a safe, not in a drawer, not under a pillow, in the oven. He pressed the paper into her hand and held it there for one moment, his hand warm over her cold fingers. She knew who would find it. Not me. He let go. You keep it. Bernadette Moss arrived at 7 o'clock the next morning, and she didn't bring coffee. That was the first detail Delaney noticed. The second was that she didn't sit down. There's a lawsuit, Bernadette said. She set a stack of papers on the wooden counter Delaney had scrubbed clean the week before. Filed at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, right before the courthouse closed. They chose that hour deliberately so we'd have as little time as possible. Delaney wiped her hands on her apron. Who's being sued? The trust. Bernadette opened to the first page. The plaintiff's name is Everett Crane. His company is called Crane Meridian Development. He isn't asking to buy anything, and that's the clever part. She tapped an ink-stained finger against a line in the middle of the page. He's asking the court to appoint a temporary property manager over all 11 properties the trust owns on Mercer Street. What does that mean? It means he's arguing that the trust is no longer capable of managing its own property, Bernadette said. If the court agrees, a stranger gets brought in to manage all 11 places. That person has the authority to lease them, the authority to mortgage them, and, in some circumstances, the authority to sell them in order to preserve their value. She looked up. He doesn't need to buy the land. He only needs to get his hand on the doorknob. Delaney looked at the papers. When's the hearing? 11 days from now. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled past the end of the street. Does he know yet? Delaney asked. He's known since last night, Bernadette said. He sat with the lawyers until 3 o'clock in the morning. She turned 2 more pages, then stopped and didn't turn another. There's a second thing. You need to know this one because it involves you. Delaney waited. Curtis Pell didn't just sell you a piece of paper, Bernadette said. He took that deed and recorded it with the county recorder's office, paid the filing fee properly, got an entry number, a date, and a time. She looked Delaney straight in the eyes. Which means that for the last 6 weeks, according to the public records of Cook County, this property hasn't belonged to the Castellano Family Trust. It's belonged to Delaney Shaw. Delaney stood frozen. 6 weeks, she said, but I only bought it 4 days ago. You signed the papers 4 days ago, Bernadette said. He recorded it 6 weeks ago. It took Delaney a moment to understand what that meant. Then she did, and cold moved down both of her arms. He recorded it before he met me. Before he ever met you, Bernadette confirmed. Your name was in the county records before you even knew a man named Curtis Pell existed. Delaney turned away from the counter. She needed to do something with her hands. Anything. She remembered that she hadn't written down how much flour she needed to order for the following week, and she reached into her apron pocket for the pencil she always kept there. The pencil came out first, and with it, a small piece of stiff card fell onto the brick floor, turning once in the air before landing face up at her feet. Delaney bent down and picked it up. Ivory cardstock, dark blue raised lettering. In the center were 3 words she had heard for the first time in her life less than 10 minutes earlier. Crane Meridian Development. She stood there with the card in her hand and didn't breathe. What's wrong? Bernadette asked. Delaney couldn't answer at first. She remembered the moment the briefcase clasp had broken in that temporary rented office that very morning, spilling its contents across the floor as she bent to help, completely unaware that Pell had already entered her name into the county records 6 weeks before she had ever laid eyes on him. She saw her own hand holding out a business card. She saw Pell's fingers snatching it away faster than they needed to. And now, only now, she remembered a detail she'd told Raphael in the dining room behind the restaurant kitchen on that first night. A detail even she herself hadn't noticed at the time. She had picked up 2 cards. She'd handed one back to him. The other she'd slipped into her apron pocket as she stood up, out of the habit of someone who worked in a kitchen, the habit of picking up anything that fell on the floor and putting it in a pocket to deal with later. Then she'd forgotten about it. For 6 weeks she'd carried it with her, through 3 weeks in the car, through the morning she handed over all $4,200, through the night she got into Rafael Castellano's car, through every day of scraping paint and digging out ash. It had been in her pocket while she sat on the brick floor reading the letter. Bernadette, Delaney said. Her voice was very calm, and it was that calmness that made the other woman step closer. She held out the business card. Bernadette looked at it, and for 3 seconds she didn't say anything at all. Then she pulled her phone from the pocket of her coat. Delaney stood in the middle of the room, flooded with the light she'd uncovered with her own hands by scraping those windows clean. And she understood something very simple and very cold. For weeks she'd believed she'd bought the wrong place, that out of thousands of abandoned buildings in this city, her bad luck had somehow found the one building that couldn't be sold. That wasn't what had happened. She hadn't bought the wrong place. Someone had sold it to her. That exact place, on that exact day, after putting her name into the county records 6 weeks earlier. They met in the dining room behind the restaurant kitchen at 11 o'clock that morning, and this time the long table was completely empty, with none of the 4 men sitting there eating. Raphael's attorney was a woman named Adele Fournier, about 50, with short silver hair, carrying 2 file cases that she set down on the table in a precise order, rather than simply dropping them there. She looked at Delaney exactly once when Delaney walked in, then didn't look at her again. "Before we begin," Adele said, "I need everyone in this room to understand one thing. We are not going to win this case by proving Everett Crane is a bad man. He doesn't need to be good. He only needs to prove one thing." She opened the first file case, that this trust has failed to take proper care of its own property. Raphael sat at the head of the table, with both hands resting on the wood, saying nothing. "The law doesn't care who is dishonest," Adele continued. "In this kind of petition, the law asks only one question. Did the trustee fulfill his duty? If the answer is no, the court has the authority to put someone else in charge, no matter how honorable the previous trustee may be." She took out a sheet of paper, a stamped copy from the Cook County Recorder's office, and slid it into the middle of the table. And this is where the case gets bad. Delaney looked down at the document. She saw her own name, a deed transferring ownership into the name of someone completely unrelated to the Castellano family has been sitting openly in the county land records for 6 weeks. Adele said, 6 weeks. Anyone could have found it by paying an $8 search fee. During those 6 weeks, the trustee had no idea it was there. Didn't discover it, didn't object to it, didn't file a correction. She tapped one finger against the tabletop. That isn't a minor detail. That is their entire case. Bernadette spoke from where she stood beside the kitchen door. But that deed is forged. Yes, Adele said. And that doesn't help us. It makes things worse. She turned toward Raphael. Look at it from the judge's point of view. If a fraudulent document can be entered into the county records and sit there for 6 weeks without anyone on the trust's side noticing, then Crane's argument isn't merely valid. We've proven it for him. No one spoke for a long while. Delaney could hear the dishwasher running behind the kitchen door. There's more, Adele said, and this time she turned toward Delaney. Miss Shaw, I'm going to be direct because you're going to hear this in court, and I'd rather you hear it from me first. Delaney nodded. The deed in your pocket is the strongest piece of physical evidence the plaintiff has, Adele said. But it isn't the strongest thing they have. She closed the file case. The strongest thing they have is you. Delaney didn't understand at first. A judge can glance at a piece of paper and move on, Adele said. But when a 27-year-old woman walks into a courtroom and says she paid $4,200, that she was handed the keys, that she moved in, that she repaired the roof, fired the oven, openly served fresh bread to the whole neighborhood on that exact property, and no one from the trust came to stop her. She paused. That's a picture. And pictures beat arguments. Delaney sat very still. He doesn't need me to lie under oath, she said slowly. No, Adele replied. He needs you to tell the truth. All of it, exactly as it happened. That's the most dangerous thing about this. Delaney lifted a hand to touch the pocket of her apron, where the business card and the deed lay side by side. $4,200. 9 months she'd kept that money without spending a single cent. The last thing left of Wesley. The only thing in the world that had ever carried her name. She had handed all of it over in exchange for a piece of paper. And now she understood that the paper had never been what she'd bought. It was what someone needed her to carry for them. 6 weeks, she said softly. They put my name into the county records 6 weeks before I met Pell, which means the clock started running then. Exactly, Adele said. They didn't need you living there for long. They needed enough time for it to look like neglect. 6 weeks is more than enough. Delaney thought of the intact brick oven Pell had led her straight toward without saying a single word about the leaking roof. She thought of the bakery on Kedzie Street being sold to a company with no history. She thought of the 9 months that money had sat untouched in her account, and of the fact that someone had known even that. They chose me because I had no one, she said. If I'd had parents, brothers, or sisters, even one friend who was a lawyer, I would have asked questions before I signed. Adele Fournier didn't answer. She didn't need to. Rafael Castellano was still sitting silently at the head of the table, and when Delaney looked up at him, he was watching her. And there was something on his face she'd never seen there before. It wasn't anger. It was something much quieter and much worse. It was the face of a man who had every means in the world to solve a problem, and was forbidden from using a single one of them. 3 days later, close to noon, someone pushed open the door and walked into the bakery. Delaney was standing on a ladder wiping down the upper window frame when she heard the old wind chime she'd rehung the week before. She looked down. Grant Hart stood in the middle of the floor holding a slim document case, wearing a wool coat finer than anything he'd ever worn during the 4 years she'd been part of that family. Delaney climbed down the ladder slowly. She said nothing. "This place looks better than I expected," Grant said. He looked around, at the scrubbed counter, at the light pouring through windows no longer covered in black paint. "You were always good at this kind of thing. What do you want?" Grant set the document case on the counter. "I work for Crane Meridian," he said. "Director of Acquisitions. Started in October." Delaney stood still. One piece after another slid into place inside her mind, and not one of them surprised her. That was what made her cold. "The bakery on Kedzie Street," she said. "Your mother didn't find the buyer herself. You brought them to her." Grant didn't deny it. He opened the case, took out 2 sets of papers, and placed them side by side on the counter, as though laying out 2 pieces of merchandise. "This is a consulting agreement," he said. "Notarized. The company hires you as a bakery industry consultant for the Mercer Development Project. 6 months. Half paid up front." He turned to the page with the amount. $200,000. Delaney didn't look at the number. She looked at the second set of papers. "And that one?" "Witness statement," Grant said. "Already drafted. Our lawyers did it. You just read it, and if it's accurate, you sign. If anything isn't right, we change it." He pushed it toward her. "It's all true, Delaney. You paid $4,200. You took the keys. You moved in. You started repairing the place, fired the oven, handed bread to the whole block in broad daylight. No one from their side ever came and told you to leave." He shrugged. "All you have to do is tell exactly what happened." Delaney looked at the 2 sets of papers lying side by side on the wooden counter she'd scrubbed clean with her own hands after 14 years of dust. "You know that if I sign this, the court will hand this place to your company. The court will put it under an independent manager," Grant said. "That's the court's business, not yours." He tapped 2 fingers against the consulting agreement. "Your business is $200,000 and 6 months of work. Think about it. You're 27 years old, you're sleeping in a borrowed room above a restaurant, and you're working for free in a building you don't have a single legal piece of paper to." He paused, and his voice softened into the tone. Delaney remembered well, the same tone he'd used at the funeral. "You don't have anything left anyway. Think of it as us giving the bakery back to you." Delaney stood very still for a long time. She looked at the 2 sets of papers, at the red notary seal in the lower right corner, at the blank line waiting for her signature. Then she looked up. "Do you know how much Wesley left me?" she asked. Grant didn't answer. "Do you know?" she asked again. He looked away. $4,200, Delaney said. "A life insurance policy he bought when he was 22 and forgot to cancel. It was the only thing in the world that ever had my name on it." She placed one hand on the counter, not touching the papers, only resting her palm against the wood. "I kept it for 9 months. I didn't spend a cent, even during the weeks when I ate 1 meal a day." She continued, her voice still flat. "Then you people sent someone to sell me a piece of paper, and you took that too." Grant still wouldn't look at her. "Now you come back here with 200,000, she said. "That's almost 50 times what you took from me. Do you know what that tells me?" She pushed the 2 sets of papers back toward him, slowly, until they rested at the edge of the counter. "It tells me this place is worth a lot more than that." Grant stood there for another moment. Then he gathered the papers, without hurrying, without saying anything else, and closed the document case. At the door he stopped. "I left my phone number," he said. "You have 8 days." Then he walked out, and the wind chime gave one small sound behind him. That night, Delaney didn't sleep. She lay on the single bed above the restaurant staring at the ceiling, and what kept her awake wasn't the $200,000. She had pushed that out of her mind the moment Grant walked through the door. more easily than she'd expected. What kept her awake was something she had seen clearly for the first time while lying there, and it was so simple, it was cruel. Adele Fournier had said the strongest thing Crane had wasn't the deed, it was Delaney, which meant there was only one way to take that weapon out of his hands. She would have to stand in court and testify herself that she had no right to this building, that she never had, that the paper she'd paid $4,200 for was worthless, and that she knew it. She thought of the brick oven, of the mark carved into the storage room wall, of the letter folded along 4 creases inside her apron pocket. The only thing that could save this building was also the thing that would make her walk out of that courtroom empty-handed, for the second time in her life, before the same family. 3 days remained before the hearing, and Delaney Shaw went looking for a bread recipe. She wasn't looking for evidence. For the past 2 weeks, 4 people from Adele Fournier's office had searched every cabinet, every drawer, every crack in the walls of that building, and they'd taken away everything that looked even remotely like paperwork. Delaney knew she wasn't better at that than they were. What she'd been thinking about through several sleepless nights was one single phrase, 2 words spoken on the sidewalk at 5 o'clock in the morning by a man standing there eating bread in a black wool coat. This smell. He hadn't said it was good. He hadn't said thank you. He'd said this smell, then stood silent for a very long time, and Delaney had understood even then that the scent of the bread she'd baked had only been almost right, close enough to open a door inside his mind, but not enough to walk through it. She wanted to make that exact loaf. She wanted to hand him a loaf identical to the bread he'd eaten when he was 19 years old, before he told his mother to stop. That was the only reason. She began where any baker would begin, not with the cabinets, not with the drawers, with the place where the baker stood. In a bakery, a baker stands in the same spot for 10 hours every day, between the flour bin and the kneading table, with everything they need within reach. Delaney stood in that spot and looked down at her feet. The wooden floor there was more worn than anywhere else, worn into 2 dark shapes like footprints side by side, the marks left by 20 years of one woman standing in the same position. Delaney knelt and ran her fingers along the seams between the boards. The 3rd plank lifted. It wasn't nailed down. It simply fit tightly into the groove, and on its underside was a small notch the size of a fingertip, just enough to hook a finger into and pull. Beneath it was a hollow in the concrete foundation, and inside that hollow was a notebook wrapped in oilcloth. The blue cloth cover had faded, the spine had been sewn by hand with coarse thread, and the corners had been worn round from being opened too many times. Delaney sat down on the floor and opened it. The first page held a recipe for white bread, written in the same slanting handwriting faded to brown that she'd read in the letter. Along the margin were pencil notes added over the years, one on top of another. Less salt, less yeast in summer. Socolo flour is damp this week. The next page was rye bread, then almond pastries, then a kind of roll whose name was written in Italian that Delaney couldn't read. On the 9th page was a recipe that had been crossed out and rewritten 3 times, and beside the 3rd version were 2 words. That's right. She turned each page one by one, and it took her nearly an hour to get through the entire notebook. Not because it was thick, but because she stopped in so many places. Then she reached the final page. The final page wasn't a recipe. It was a list. Names written in a column, each one accompanied by a date. Some names appeared only once. Others appeared 3 or 4 times, years apart. Beside some of them were a few short notes. Has small children. Lost job at the slaughterhouse. Husband left. That winter. The list began with a name dated November 1992, and it continued across 3 full pages, dense with writing, until the final entry dated February 2012, exactly 20 years. Delaney counted 143 names. There were no notes about money. No column saying who had paid anything back. She understood what she was holding, and she had to let the notebook rest in her lap for a moment before turning farther. Pinned to the inside of the back cover with a paper clip rusted reddish-brown was a sheet of paper folded into quarters. Delaney removed it and opened it. It was a copy of a notarized declaration. The paper was thin, the kind of carbon copy paper offices had used years ago, and the typed words had faded in several places. It stated that Rosa Castellano, residing at 1408 Mercer Street, had declared her intention regarding the aforementioned property before a notary public. There was no embossed seal, no filing number, only a handwritten signature in the lower right corner, and beneath it the name of the notary typed in capital letters, Harold Kessler. Delaney stared at that name for a long time. Then she stood, pressed the notebook against her chest, and walked toward the door without even taking off her apron. On the way out, she thought about Adele Fournier and the 4 people who had searched this building for 2 weeks. People who knew exactly where to look for documents inside a house, who knew how to open safes, how to lift the bottoms of drawers, how to inspect every loose brick in a wall. Not one of them had thought to look beneath their own feet, because to think of that, a person had to know something very small and very particular, something that wasn't written in any law book in the world. They had to know where a baker stands. Harold Kessler was 84 years old and lived in a ground-floor apartment in Oak Lawn with his daughter. When Delaney and Bernadette arrived, he was sitting in an armchair beside the window, a blanket spread across his lap, looking out at a small yard where a bird feeder had gone so long without seed that no one could remember the last time it had been filled. His daughter, a woman of about 60 named Renata, warned them at the door that some days my father remembers everything. Some days he doesn't remember who I am, and today I don't know which kind of day it is yet. Delaney sat in the chair across from him. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "I'd like to ask you about someone." The old man turned his head toward her, and his gaze passed through her before settling somewhere on the wall behind her. "Rosa Castellano," Delaney said. There was a silence of about 2 seconds. Then his face changed, slowly, like a room where someone had just switched on a light at the far end. He lifted his head. He smiled. "She brought bread every Friday," he said. His voice was rough but perfectly clear. "She walked here. Never let anyone drive her. She'd leave a loaf on the reception desk, and she never took money. So I had to tell my secretary to slip cash into the paper bag when her back was turned." He gave a quiet laugh to himself. "She knew. She always knew. But she let me do it because she understood I needed to give something back." Renata stood in the kitchen doorway and lifted a hand to cover her mouth. Delaney held out the faded carbon copy. "Do you remember this, sir?" The old man took it, held it at arm's length, and narrowed his eyes. He read for a long time. Then he said, without looking up, "This was her copy. Mine is in the journal." Renata had left the kitchen doorway before he finished the sentence. She returned 7 minutes later, carrying a cardboard box, and set it on the coffee table. Inside were 7 hardbound journals with cloth spines, each year written in ink along the back. She was a notary, she explained. She'd taken over her father's practice in 1994, and state law required notarial journals to be preserved. So she had kept every one of them, even the books from before she was born. The journal from 2012 was 4th from the top. Page 12, March 12th. There was Rosa Castellano's signature, curved and firm, written across the ruled line. There was an embossed notary seal, every ridge still visible in the paper. There was an entry number, and in the remarks column on the right, written by hand in the orderly script of a man who had spent his life working with documents, was one sentence. "Client requests it be stated clearly. The place must not be sold. It must be kept to feed people." Raphael arrived 20 minutes later. He lifted the journal in both hands and stood reading that sentence in the middle of a stranger's living room, and Delaney saw the tip of one finger tremble once against the edge of the hard cover. Only once. He set the journal down immediately afterward and didn't speak for nearly a minute. He thanked Renata in one short sentence. He bent to shake Harold Kessler's hand and held it a little longer than necessary. That evening, in the dining room behind the kitchen, Adele Fournier placed a new set of papers on the table. "We can win," she said. "But I have a more certain way, and I'm obligated to present it." She pushed the papers toward Delaney. "The trust formally transfers the property at 1408 Mercer Street to you. Before the hearing. Legally, properly, notarized." She continued. "Then Crane's entire argument collapses immediately, because there is no longer a disputed deed. You become the lawful and permanent owner of this building." No one said anything. Delaney looked at the papers. She thought about the brick oven, about the mark hidden beneath 4 layers of paint, about the 143 handwritten names on the final pages of the cloth-bound notebook. "No," she said. Adele Fournier looked up. "You understand exactly what you're refusing." "I do," Delaney said. "But listen to what you just said. Crane is arguing that this trust isn't capable of caring for its property, that it gives things away, loses them, lets them slip out of its hands." She pushed the papers back. "And our answer is for the trust to give away a building to a woman who was sleeping in her car 3 weeks ago. What do you think he's going to say to the judge?" Adele was silent. And there's something else, Delaney said more quietly. She didn't keep this place so it could belong to one person. She kept it to feed people. If I sign that, I become the 104th person in her notebook, and I also become the last. Because after me, the door closes. Raphael sat at the head of the table, and he didn't object with a single word. After Adele left, the two of them remained in the room with 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold. Tomorrow, Raphael said. If we lose, I have nothing. Delaney looked at him. What do you mean? I mean nothing, he said. No midnight phone call. No one going to knock on his door. No name I can mention that makes this disappear before morning. He turned his coffee cup once against the tabletop. For 34 years, anything I've lost, I've found another way to take back. Tomorrow is the first time in my life I'll have to sit in a room and let other people decide something without me standing in the middle of it. He looked up, and Delaney saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen once in all the weeks she'd known him. I don't know how to do that, he said. Courtroom 412 of the Cook County Courthouse was smaller than Delaney had imagined, and colder. Everett Crane sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 attorneys and didn't turn around once. Grant Hart sat in the 3rd row. Raphael sat at the back of the room with his hands resting in his lap, and he didn't say a single word that entire morning. Crane's attorney called Delaney to the stand exactly as they had planned from the beginning. The plaintiff's witness, the woman who would tell the story herself and bring down the Castellano family trust. She raised her hand and took the oath. The first question was exactly as Adele had warned her it would be. Was she the person who had purchased the property at 1408 Mercer Street? No, Delaney said. The attorney faltered for half a beat. He held up a copy of the deed and asked whether the signature on it was hers. The signature is mine, she said, but I didn't buy anything. I paid $4,200 for a worthless piece of paper, and I knew that by the 4th day after I signed it. She looked directly at the judge. The so-called tax debt auction that day was staged. There was only me, the broker, and a man sitting in the corner of the room whom I've never seen again. The attorney asked that the witness be instructed to answer only the question asked. The judge allowed her to continue. Delaney went on, her voice flat and even, the same voice she'd practiced for 3 weeks in the car. She told them about the leather briefcase with the broken clasp and the 2 business cards that fell onto the floor, about how she'd handed one back and accidentally slipped the other into her apron pocket, and she read aloud the 3 words printed on it: Crane Meridian Development. She told them that her name had been entered into the county land records 6 weeks before the day she first met Curtis Pell. She told them about the 2 sets of papers laid side by side on the bakery counter 8 days earlier, a notarized consulting agreement worth $200,000, and a prepared witness statement, waiting only for her signature, and she named the man who had brought them. The entire courtroom turned toward the 3rd row. Then she said the last thing. I have no right whatsoever to that building, she said. I never did. I was offered a lawful transfer before this hearing, and I refused it. I didn't accept it, and I don't want it. She stepped down from the witness stand with empty hands, but this time, every step was entirely by her own choice. After that, the lawsuit had nowhere left to stand. Crane's entire argument rested on a disputed deed and a woman in actual possession of the property, and both had just removed themselves from the board. Adele Fournier submitted the 2012 notarial journal to the court, and Harold Kessler was brought into the courtroom in a wheelchair, and the old man sat there squinting at page 12 for a long while, before looking up and saying, "That is my handwriting. I wrote that line because she asked me to write it. She said if you only say something out loud, people forget." No one in the room said anything for several seconds afterward. Curtis Pell testified during the afternoon session. 3 days earlier, Delaney had sent a notarized statement to the prosecutor's office, voluntarily waiving any restitution that might be awarded to her in any case involving him. His attorney used that very document to ask for leniency, and Pell told them everything. He testified about who had given him the list of widowed women on the South Side who had recently sold homes or businesses. He testified about who had paid the filing fee at the county recorder's office. Every trail led back to an escrow account in the name of Crane Meridian Development. Everett Crane left the courtroom at 4:15 that afternoon, with his lawsuit dismissed in full. Development permits for 3 projects suspended pending review, and a file newly referred to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. He didn't look at anyone as he walked out. Grant Hart lost his job before the end of that week, and Delaney learned about it from a short notice in the local paper rather than from a phone call. Rafael Castellano sat silently at the back of the room through the entire hearing. He didn't stand up once. He didn't say a single word. And in all 34 years of his life, it was the first time he'd won a fight without having to touch anyone. In the hallway, he found her standing beside the window at the top of the stairs. "You just threw away the only thing you had left," he said. Delaney looked through the glass, where the December sky was darkening over the rooftops. "No," she said. "I threw away the only thing I never had." 3 days later, a new provision was added to the Castellano family trust, drafted by Adele Fournier and signed by the trust's sole trustee. The provision bore the name Rosa Castellano. It stated that the property at 1408 Mercer Street could never be sold, mortgaged, or transferred to any individual, including anyone in the family. And it added one more condition, something Adele said she'd never written into a legal document in 27 years of practice, that for as long as the building remained standing, there must always be someone inside it standing at the oven. That winter on the south side of Chicago was long and gray, and Delaney Shaw worked through every bit of it. She replaced the rear section of the roof with 2 of the 3 men who had first come to help, tore out all the rotted plumbing, and refinished the wooden counter until the grain rose back to the surface the way it had when the wood was new. Bernadette Moss came by almost every morning, bringing coffee and old books she found at a bookstore on Halsted Street, baking books printed in the 1960s with covers already pulling loose from their bindings, and she had very strong opinions about how the kitchen should be arranged. Opinions she presented as though they were the findings of a committee, rather than her own personal preferences. Delaney listened to all of them, followed half, argued with the other half, and both women liked the arrangement exactly that way. The carving in the storage room was restored in January. Delaney did it alone, a little each evening, using a small chisel and a wooden mallet, following every worn line and bringing it back to its original depth. She added nothing. She didn't make it prettier. The sheaf of wheat inside the unfinished circle, the 2 roots running downward, and beneath them the word Entra, exactly as a woman had carved it there long before Delaney was born. One Saturday morning, before the snow had melted, the wind chime sounded at the door. The woman who came in was named Marisol, 31 years old, and she said from the threshold that she'd heard the neighbors praising the bread here and wanted to know whether the bakery needed anyone for the morning shift. With her was a 6-year-old girl named Nell, who had no school that day and had come along with her mother. Nell started asking questions from the moment she crossed the doorway. Who lights a fire in an oven this big? Does dough sleep? Why does bread rise? Don't your hands get burned? The little girl climbed onto the tall stool at the counter and sat swinging both legs while Delaney gave her a stub of pencil and the back of a sheet of bread wrapping paper. Nell drew the oven. She drew it so large it nearly filled the entire page, with a square oven door and spirals of smoke curling upward, and she explained very carefully that this part was the fire and this part was the bread waiting for its turn. Delaney took out a small loaf of milk bread that had just come from the oven and set it in front of her. Nell took one bite, chewed very slowly, then announced with the grave expression of someone delivering an important conclusion that this was better than birthday cake. Everyone in the kitchen laughed, including Bernadette, who had always insisted that she didn't laugh. Marisol started the morning shift the following Monday. Early in the spring, Rafael Castellano arrived without an escort car. He wasn't wearing the black wool coat. He wore a gray sweater, and in one hand, he carried a bundle of rosemary he'd cut somewhere along the way, holding it a little awkwardly, the way a man did when he wasn't used to carrying flowers or herbs in his hands. Delaney was wiping down the tables on the porch when he came. He handed her the rosemary. Then he reached into his pocket and took out a worn leather cord, and hanging from it was a plain gold ring set with a dark red stone. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it all the time, even when she kneaded dough, so she threaded it onto a cord and wore it around her neck." He looked down at the ring lying in his palm. "She once told my father she didn't want to leave it to some daughter-in-law just because the woman married into the family. She said she wanted it to belong to someone who had walked through a very hard door and still chose to stay." He looked up at her. "I've thought about it for a long time. I can't think of anyone who deserves it more." Delaney looked at the ring, looked at the man holding it, looked at the building behind her with its bright windows and open door. She thought of a line written in ink that had faded to brown. "From here on, you feed people." She held out her hand. Many years later, the bakery at 1408 Mercer Street became known throughout the city, and people told stories about it the way people told stories about places that somehow found them rather than the other way around. There was an old carving on the storage room wall that regular customers liked to show to newcomers. There was a small lamp in the window that no one ever remembered seeing turned off. There was a cloth-bound notebook displayed beneath glass on the counter, open to the final page, where a handwritten list continued to grow as new names were added beneath the old ones. Bernadette Moss retired and moved to the end of the block, and every morning she was there before whoever was supposed to unlock the door. Raphael continued running his affairs with the same old precision, but the people who had known him for years all noticed that he'd stopped wearing his grief like a suit of armor. And Nell, now grown, still claimed the job of running to the door and opening it before visitors could finish knocking, because she'd been doing it since she was 6 years old, and no one in that house ever thought of taking that duty away from her. Some doors look broken, sealed shut, abandoned by everyone who ever passed them, only to turn out to be the exact door that was meant for us. Some acts of kindness are planted and lie silent for 20 years, seeming completely lost, until the day someone who needs them happens to pass by and picks them up. And in the end, what a person leaves behind in this world isn't what they owned, but the doors they managed to leave open for the people who came after them. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can keep listening together to more beautiful stories every day. How did Delaney's story and the house on Mercer Street make you feel? And if you've ever stood before a door you thought had closed on you forever, we'd truly love to hear your story in the comments, told in your own words from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.